Okay, so just a quick question to start me off. So who here's ever been to a theme park? Okay, show of hands. Yep. So whether it's up on the Gold Coast, whether it's Jamboree, whether it's Wet n Wild Sydney, so we've all been to one. Raise your hand if you haven't been to one before. Cool, that works really well. Okay, so can you all think of the guys on the front gate? So the guys who help you get into the park. So these guys help you out, you have to get tickets from them. Without them, you can't actually get into the park. But once you're in the park, there are a whole bunch of rules. So for example, you have to wait in queues, there are set times for when it's open or when it closes, and the food's incredibly expensive. Now, in the Old Testament, priests were intermediaries between God and the people. They were like employees at an amusement park or a theme park. They worked as middlemen between the people and God. In Hebrews 9, 1-7, let me just open up to it. It says this. Now the first covenant had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary. The tabernacle was set up in its first room with a lampstand, the table, and consecrated bread. This was called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a room called the most holy place, which had the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered ark of the covenant. This ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. Above the ark were the cherubim of the glory, overshadowing the atonement cover, but we cannot discuss these things in detail now. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry, but only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins the people had committed in ignorance. Okay, so, I don't know about you, but that was really complicated. There's a whole bunch of weird stuff in there. It was like angels overshadowing like a ark thing. There was a big tent. So it's very confusing. In the Old Testament, there was a whole sequence of rituals that needed to take place for the people to come into contact with God. So in the Old Testament, God's people, the Jews, there were 12 tribes within them. Now one of these tribes was the Levites. Now these Levites were the priests. You couldn't just walk off the street one day and say, hey, I want to be a priest. No. You had to be born into it. If your father was a priest, chances are you'd be a priest as well. It was hereditary. It's just a fancy word. Okay, so can anyone tell me what one of the priests' major jobs was in the Old Testament? Yep, I heard it down the front here somewhere. To make sacrifices. Thank you. Okay, so they had to offer sacrifices for the people to atone for their sins. They had to kill animals so that God would accept the people. But the priests weren't perfect. They had to also offer sacrifices for themselves. In Hebrews 5, verse 2-3, it says, he is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. This is talking about the priests of the Old Testament. Because they were sinful, they could sympathize with the people because they themselves were sinful. They had committed wrong deeds, they had done all the stuff that any other human being does. But they were chosen by God to act as go-between between him and the people of that time. They also had to offer sacrifices constantly. They had to offer them month after month, year after year, decade after decade, for hundreds of years, but the sacrifices weren't perfect enough. A couple of weeks ago we had Josh's example of the scapegoat, where there was one goat which was slaughtered in front of all the people, was killed to atone for their sins, and another goat was run out of town to signify that the sins were being taken far away. The priest system of the Old Testament was a temporary solution. And then Jesus comes in. So continuing on with the theme park idea, how much better would it be if you were best friends, and I mean like really close friends, with the owner of the theme park's son? So imagine that son has keys and he just gives you a copy because you're best friends, like he trusts you. So you can just go into the theme park whenever you want. The food's free, you don't have to wait in queues, there's no set times. You can go at midnight if you wanted to, as long as your parents let you, of course. Jesus is like that son. He's the Son of God, and he now acts as the intermediary between us and him. Hebrews 7, verse 21 to 22. But he became a priest with an oath when God said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." Because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. Jesus is the new high priest. In Hebrews 3, verse 1, it says, "Therefore, holy brothers who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, the apostle and high priest." Now, in contrast to the priests of the Old Testament, Jesus was appointed by God. He was not a Levite. It says he descended directly from the line of David, but he was not a Levite. He was not born into being a priest. He was perfect. He had no need to offer sacrifices for his own sins because he had none. But he can also sympathize with us because he came down to earth. He suffered everything that we suffer, sometimes worse. He died on a cross. He was crucified, ridiculed, but he had no sin. And ultimately he gave his life for us. He only needed to offer one sacrifice throughout his whole life, and he offered himself. Now, when Jesus died on the cross, let me just find another verse. Now, this verse relates to the Old Testament temple and something that happened when Jesus died on the cross. Let me just read this out. It's Luke 23, verse 45. "For the sun stopped shining and the curtain of the temple was torn in two." Now, in reference to that verse that I read out earlier, the big confusing one, there was this place called the Holy of Holies. Now, in this place, only the high priest could enter, and only once a year, and only with an offer of blood as a sacrifice. But when Jesus died on the cross, this curtain that separated the people from God was ripped in two, from the top to the bottom, to show that no man could have done it. When Jesus died on the cross, he took away that barrier that blocks us from having access to God. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to break up into some small groups like we do every other week. So Josh is going to come up. He's going to explain it over here.